Good morning. It's good to see each of you. We're continuing our study through the book of Revelation, and we almost finished chapter 11. The only thing I had left is just to kind of pause and think about what big, open, remaining questions are still out there that haven't been answered. And so I'm going to actually start by asking you, what kind of things do you think are kind of left unresolved, unanswered at this point? There'll be lots of little questions that we'll have. What about this little thing, that little thing? But big questions. What things are still kind of hanging out there?
The bottomless pit and the things that come out of the bottomless pit.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of references to the bottomless pit. Specifically, in reference to that, we've got this beast out of the bottomless pit that we saw in chapter 11. And then we had a reference to a king who was over the locust things that came out of the bottomless pit in chapter 9. And we have some idea of what those are, but is there a connection there? What else?
We haven't seen much about the great city yet.
All right, so we've had a reference to this great city, but yet no real identification of that. In fact, when we looked at that last time, all of the references that we had were all forward-looking. None of those had just come, so that's a good one. All right, so just a few others. Just continue to think about this beast and this king. Why are they warring against the saints? We know that they are, but we're not told why. And we're not told how they can overcome. I mean, we're given that imperative. Jesus gives that to the churches in chapters 2 and 3. But he doesn't tell them how exactly that they're supposed to do that. And then we know that there's this period of 42 months, and there seems to be a lot of things going on. What all is happening during this time period? And then just the basic question that the saints under the altar asked, how long? I mean, how much longer is this going to keep going? That also hasn't been answered yet. We know that it has to be when their number is complete, but that's it. So what happens next? After God does step in and judge and avenge and set these things right, what's going to happen next? What's going to be the condition of God's people on earth after that's over with? And then, just like when Jesus was talking to his apostles in Matthew 24 and telling them about how there wouldn't be one stone left on top of another in the destruction of Jerusalem, they went immediately to, when is this going to be? When's going to be the sign of your coming? And when is the end of the world going to happen? And that seems to be kind of just man's nature. Whenever we start hearing about these terrible things, we just kind of like naturally assume, or we relate it to, or we're just curious about the end of the world. How is it all going to end? Not just this, but how is all things going to end? Daniel seems to have kind of jumped to the same question here at the end of chapter 12:8. And so, again, I think this is kind of like a human nature, and we're going to get some answers to that before this is over with. So to answer all these questions, even though we've kind of gone through the big picture already, these things have not been taken care of. So we're going to have to take a step back. We're going to have to look at a bigger picture. We're going to have to introduce more characters, if you will, into this scene before we can really answer these questions effectively. So that's what we're going to do next, is begin to look at some of these things. All right, so as we get into chapter 12, we're going to have the main characters, this child, the woman, and the dragon. And it opens up in verse 1 by saying, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne." All right, so let's go through and identify these 3 characters best we can based off the description here and then what we see elsewhere in Scripture leading up to this point. So we're told that this dragon, in a few verses, he's going to be associated with the serpent. So keeping that part of the description in mind, Where else do we first read about a serpent, a woman, and a child?
Well, without the child.
Do what?
Well, no, chapter 3.
Yeah, Genesis 3. We have all three of those in Genesis 3, right? So this is a very ancient conflict that we are going all the way back to the beginning of all things. So Genesis 3:13-15, the Lord said to the woman, "What is this you've done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." So God spoke to the serpent, "Because you have done this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So even at the beginning here of Genesis 3, we have these same three parties to some extent that are brought up here. In the picture about the bruising the head versus the bruising the heel, the idea is of a man like stepping on, like not stepping, but stomping the head of a snake. Well, what's going to happen to his heel? Maybe he gets bit, or maybe he gets a stone bruise from just stomping so hard. Okay, that's not painful. That's not pleasant. That's painful. But what does that do compared to the snake? Well, the snake gets its head crushed. So yes, there is some injury to the man, but the snake is the one that endures the moral wound, if you will. So this is a reference to Jesus ultimately. We see this being fulfilled in Jesus being crucified. He died. Yes, it was painful. It was terrible. But ultimately by Jesus being resurrected in that same stroke, if you will, then he broke the power of the devil and completely brought his power to an end, as we're told in Hebrews 2:9-15. So this is one of the first places we see this, and I think this ties all the way back to this, even though we're going to have to refine this symbol just a little bit. So thinking about the woman, we have this same kind of symbol used all the way back in Joseph's dream. Remember about where there were the woman with the sun and the moon and the stars, and Jacob understood that that was a reference to Joseph's mother at that time. So again, this idea of the 12 and the stars seems to be a reference to, like we've seen before, to all of God's people at any given time. Again, going back to the 12 tribes. So it seems to be a reference to that in some way. So that being said, what do you think specifically it refers to? Who is this exalted woman?
Could it possibly be Israel?
It's a good possibility. I mean, we've got the 12 over them. Why do you think Israel?
Because it's the seed from which Jesus came from.
Okay.
The tribe from which Jesus came from.
All right, very good. So, one problem with that, how did Israel end up as a nation?
They were no longer God's chosen people.
Right. And as a whole, how did they turn out? Exalted? Sun, moon, stars over their head? No. So there's a mismatch there that makes it hard to fit that exactly. But I think that's on the right track. So there is a phrase that you see throughout the Old Testament, starting especially with Isaiah and kind of bringing this forward. But you have this daughter of, like different kinds of nations and peoples and whatnot. And so the idea of the daughter of Zion, which was the highest point in Jerusalem, often associated with Jerusalem itself, you have this reference to daughter of Zion. So here in Micah 4:8-10, it says, to the stronghold, the daughter of Zion, to you it will come, the power, the dominion will return. But for now, why do you cry aloud? There's no king in your midst. Your counselors perished. Pains have seized you like a woman in labor. Be in pain. Labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman would in birth pains. For now you shall go forth from the city, you shall dwell in the fields, into Babylon you shall go. So you have Zion being shown as a woman who's in the process of giving birth, but she's not able to actually give birth at this point. Instead, she's going to be carried off to Babylon. So this is a reference to the difficulty associated with being carried off into Babylonian captivity. But notice the tie, the reference to daughter of Zion. So Micah will continue going into chapter 5, continuing to use this image. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel. Who's that? Jesus. All right. Forth from of old, from everlasting, therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. All right, so here's where the birth actually is finally realized. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, and he will be great, and this one shall be peace. So we have this picture of, kind of like Caleb said, it seems like it's of Israel, of bringing forth the Messiah. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because of what we said, that actually, for the most part, Israel was pretty rotten. So how do you reconcile that? So I don't have it here, but I'll go ahead and pause, and we'll look at this a little bit later. Remember in Romans 9 where it says that not all are of Israel who are of Israel? There's the idea that, yes, you have physical Israel, you have the physical Jews, but there is a core spiritual remnant of Jews and of Israel that exists within inside of that. Those are the faithful, the true. Those would have been the ones who would have been exalted. And they would have been the ones who would have been teaching and handing the torch down, if you will, from one generation to the next. And they would have been the one responsible for kind of keeping the faith and being true to God throughout those generations. And ultimately, through them, we'll see that Jesus is the one who comes. Again, to what kind of family was Jesus born? Was he born to rebellious people who were not spiritual? Did he have to teach them about God's word? No. Mary and Joseph were faithful, good people. Think about John and Zacharias and Elizabeth. And then think about Jesus being circumcised when he was carried to the temple. Remember, there was Anna and there was Simeon that were there that were looking for. And God was, seems like he was even prolonging their life, that they were able to see the Messiah. So there was this remnant of good people, even coming up to Jesus and through him that he came. So I think that's what it's referring to. All right, so Isaiah 66 actually continues this as well, but the emphasis is a little bit different. Instead of focusing on the male child, it focuses on the nation that was born from Zion all at once. Before she was in labor, she gave birth. Before her pain came, she delivered a male child. So the idea is very suddenly, right? Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children. Shall bring the time of birth and not cause delivery. All right, so if the daughter of Zion is bringing forth the male child, then who is the nation that's born in one day? The church. Think about Acts 2. What happened in one day? 3,000 souls were added to them. So you have, whether you're focusing on the establishment of the church, the preaching of the first gospel sermon in Acts 2, or whether you're thinking of Jesus through his resurrection and his coronation, securing that people. They're very closely related, right? It would be very difficult to kind of tease out. But the idea that in this one day, this nation is born and brought into existence. But again, see the imagery. Who's doing this? It's Zion, the daughter of Zion, that's giving birth to her children suddenly. So again, to this idea of happening very quickly, you can look at Malachi 3:1. There's a similar reference there that focuses on and actually uses the word suddenly. So we have the same picture between Micah 4 and 5 and Isaiah 66. It's just a difference in who is being focused on. So the male child obviously is Jesus. The references to the rod of iron make it very clear. We see that tied to Jesus in chapter 2 already. We've seen that. And then this goes all the way back to Psalm 2. And one we keep mentioning several times because, like several of the passages we've looked at, there's very critical references that are unique there. They're obviously tied to Jesus. New Testament writers quoted it, and so it helps us to understand it, be more confident in our understanding of it. And then so many of these visions pull elements from this. So the kings of the earth set themselves against the Lord, against his anointed. They're counseling, they're plotting together, yet despite this, God has set his king on his holy hill. Again, where? Zion. And the king that he sets up is going to dash them to pieces with a rod of iron, just like a potter's vessel. Similar reference in Psalm 110, 1-5 as well. So this is always messianic whenever we see this. So again, I think this is probably one of the easiest pieces to pull out. The dragon being the next most easy. So the dragon, who is that? I mean, obviously this is the devil, right? So he's identified as the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. So this takes us very clearly back to Genesis chapter 3. I think I mentioned this before, but just for reference, so the word for devil is diablos, and for Satan is satanos. And so those are, you can tell, they're just kind of transliterated. They're not actually translated. Devil just means slanderer or accuser. And in fact, that's one of the qualifications of the women in 1 Timothy 3 is they not be diablos. They not be slanderers or accusers, as it's translated there. And then satanos is just the word for enemy. So we don't see the devil, we don't see his name, we see his function and his behavior. He's called out and identified by what he does. His name is lost. So whatever it was is not important. All that matters is what he does now. So he's the devil and Satan, and that's how he's identified here. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the dragon. We're told that he has 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his head, and then his tail is dragging 1/3 of the stars of heaven and throwing them to the earth. What do you think that means? This idea of the different heads, the horns, the crowns, and throwing the stars of heaven down. What is this a reference to?
If 10 represents like the completeness of man, then the 7 crowns and 7 heads along with it can mean like he rules man, or he controls or has power over man.
All right.
Yeah, I was surprised by that when I was reading through it, thinking about all the significance of the numbers that we talked about. I kind of expected 6 crowns, but it's like he has a complete power in a sense.
Yeah.
Which is
He wields the full power of man.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you all are right. So the 7 heads, again, most people don't make a distinction between 7 and 10. And I'm trying to tease out these nuanced differences. So kind of just take it with a grain of salt as we've been talking about this. Again, thinking about 7, going back to the first occurrence of 7, when God said, that's it, my work is done. The idea that this is the maximum amount that is allowed by God or created by God. Again, kind of numbering or being checked by God. And this is, I think, one of the things you have to keep in mind is obviously 7 is not a representation of deity itself. Otherwise, we would be saying that the devil is divine. Obviously, that's wrong. So this is something where God has he's checked it, he's limited. This is the most that he's allowed, but he's got all of it. All right, he's as smart as it gets. So in the 10 horns, again, I think he's exercising the maximum power of mankind. In the 7 diadems, again, he has this is the word for diadem. This is the word for royalty. This is not Stephanos, the crowns of victory. He never has the crowns of victory, ironically. He only has authority. And so reminds us of chapter 9:11. Remember the king over the bottomless pit? So he was the one who ruled over the locusts. And then Ephesians 2:2 talks about the prince of the power of the air who rules in the sons of disobedience. So again, think back to, what did we say the stars were? The stars represent rulers. All right, so here's someone who his reign is, his power is in the air. All right, so if we think about the stars, then again, where is his rule? It's over the kingdoms of men. And so that puts some legitimacy to the temptation that he offered Christ in Matthew 4. Bow down and worship me, and then I will give you all of these kingdoms. Remember, he took him up to the high place and showed him all the kingdoms of men. And he says, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give you these. Well, how could he offer something that wasn't in some way underneath his control, underneath his influence and authority to give? So this seems like somehow, some way, I mean, you could run rampant with speculation, right? But he was given some authority originally in the kingdoms of men, and he continues to use that, but he uses it obviously for his wicked purposes, not for what God originally intended. So this is something that God gave him that he is mistreating and misusing at this point. But again, he has it. He has all of it, the maximum power there. All right, so the drawing, the casting a third of the stars to earth. We have references to there being multiple angels that were kind of put away into Tartarus and kept away. And so we're going to see that there's a war later, and there's multiple angels, not just the devil or the dragon. So it could be a reference to the fact that these angels, we've also seen stars refer to angels as well. There seems to be a connection there going back to chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Revelation. So maybe this is a reference to angels, or again, it could be a reference, the other meaning of stars, it could be a reference to his influence over the leaders and the corruption and destruction of them. There's precedence for both of these. Daniel 8 verses 10 and 24, stars are used there to refer to rulers, not to mention Genesis 1, the stars and the sun and the moon that rule over the day and the night. All right, any questions about this? All right, so this is beginning to answer some of the questions we had. Why is this going on? This is a bigger war, a bigger conflict. And so we're starting to see that as kind of the curtain is pulled back, and we're seeing more of what's going on outside of our sphere, what's going on in heaven, or what has occurred in heaven. And so these characters are critical because it explains a lot of the fierceness, the determination, and the animosity that we're seeing being played out up to this point. All right, so what was the dragon's intention, and why did he not succeed? What was he wanting to do?
Devour the child as soon as he was born.
All right, and why did he not succeed?
Because God took the child up to heaven.
All right, so what do you think that's a reference to? If it's Jesus, then...
Right after Jesus was born, there was an attempt to kill him.
Okay, very good. So I didn't go there, but that's a good thought. I didn't think about that. So the child is caught up to God and to his throne, and so the fact that he's going up to God and to his throne, it seems like you've got kind of the whole mission of Jesus, his whole ministry from beginning to end kind of collapsed into this one statement. This is not where the focus is, all right? Like elaborate this. So, but yeah, I mean, that's a good reference about him going to Egypt in an immediate attempt on his life. So that would be certainly an example of this and the devil's temptations and constantly trying to destroy Jesus. Excuse me. But you see all this collapsed and then him being pulled up to heaven. So eventually we're thinking about his ascension and coronation there. So this is not him like escaping. The point is he succeeded in defeating the dragon. And at this point, here's one of the other key takeaways. This child succeeded, and he's going to rule the nations with the rod of iron. And then also now the devil can't get to him. All right, so he doesn't have access to him to try to destroy him anymore. So what this child was trying to do has been secured at this point, and that's not something that can be thwarted. All right, so what happened to the woman? She fled, and what did the devil do?
Started fighting the angels.
Yeah, okay. So the woman escapes. She flees into the wilderness, and she has a place prepared there by God that they should feed her 1,260 days. All right, so there's our reference again. Remember the 1260, the 42 months, the times, and half a times, 3.5 years. Same period of time that we saw in chapter 11 that's being tied in here as well. So she's fleeing into the wilderness where she's being protected. This should remind us of a few things. Think about Elijah. Remember, after he made his prophecy, he went to the wilderness and the ravens brought him food, and he was by the brook Kidron, if I remember. And so God took care of them there. I think that's probably the primary idea here, is there's a place prepared. But it also reminds us of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness and being provided for Exodus 16. So, secondary meaning of whether it's God or the Son actually providing for this woman. You could be thinking about like spiritual provision. So you may be thinking of like John 6, where Jesus talks about eating his flesh. What's he talking about there? He's talking about spiritual, about the fact that we are entirely dependent upon him. If we do not consume him spiritually, take his heart, his mind, his thoughts into our own and make them our own entirely, then we're not going to be able to survive. I think there's a good connection there, but I think that goes beyond the point here. The point here is that she's being protected. She's being taken care of. So a lot like the child, the woman is taken out of play. She is secured, she's protected, and the dragon cannot access her directly. All right, so we're not concerned about the woman herself. So again, here's the times again. And so as we start trying to take all of these references and start trying to collate them and see all the places where they're used, we're going to think about Daniel 7:25. Remember, this is the time period when the beast is warring against the saints. All right, so if we look at the references, we looked at this before, Daniel 12:7, about the time, times, and half a time. Again, even though this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's very similar wording here, because here the power of the holy people is completely shattered. All right, this is the end of the holy people. This cannot be a reference to Christianity, otherwise it would be the end of Christians. This is the end of the Jews here in Daniel 12:7. But the symbol, the usage of this, again, refers to this intense persecution. So all the places where we find this, we find in chapter 12 and 6, and I'm looking ahead a little bit into 14, we find that this is where the woman is going to be persecuted and she's going to be nurtured in the wilderness. This is also the time period we saw in the beginning of chapter 11, where the city was trodden underfoot for 42 months. And this is the time period when the two prophets were doing their work and their testimony up through that time period until they were done. We also are going to learn that it's the time period in chapter 13 that the beast is going to be blaspheming. And we know from Daniel 7, this is the time where war is happening against the saints. So all of these things, I think, are referring to the exact same period of time and the things that are occurring during this intense persecution. So I want to quickly revisit the woman and try to enrich the symbol. There's a lot of verses here. We don't have time to go through them in detail. I hope maybe you can look at them in more detail later. But this idea of a daughter of or feminizing a nation represents the feminine aspects of a people, all right? So by feminine, what do I mean? Well, there's lots of references to a people as being a virgin, the virgin daughter of. And the idea in each of those cases is you have a city or you have a people that have not been conquered. They've not been invaded. Nobody's been able to break through their walls and take over their city. You see that reference several times. We see a daughter of producing lots of children. We saw that already in Isaiah, right? A nation being given birth, her children in one day. There's also references to her sons or to her children being slaughtered by invading armies, all right? So again, we have this kind of, how would a woman react to her child, her children being destroyed, all right? The same way that a nation or a country or city would react to its soldiers being killed. So we have these feminine kind of personification of it. Isaiah 47 is going to elevate one lady, Babylon, by her being a lady, meaning that she rules over the other kingdoms. In Lamentations 1, Genesis is referred to as a princess. So the idea that why is the princess a princess instead of all the other women? It's because of who her father is. Her king, her father, is the one who elevates her and makes her special. So Lamentations 1 speaks of Jerusalem as being a princess. That's the only time where you see that version of it. And then we've probably all seen this several times where, in a similar way, this daughter of relationship, there is also kind of an unspoken male counterpart. And we see that a lot where this woman plays the harlot. She is not faithful to her husband. And that's always a reference to, and most common reference to, the spiritual treachery that Jerusalem or that Judah plays against God and not being faithful. But there are other harlots that are also, that's applied to other cities, not just Jerusalem, but that's probably the most common one. A few times you see that a woman is widowed, and the idea being is that she's left abandoned. She's not protected. So whether it's God leaving Jerusalem like a widow and letting her being destroyed, or whether there's other references to the gods of a city being destroyed and nobody's there to protect them or stop them. You see that same kind of reference there. So this is, you see all of this, and anytime you see daughter of, I want you to have this full, rich picture in mind of what's being referenced. The other thing is, you often see it, it's most easiest to tie it to like a city's capital, its stronghold, especially the ones that's fortified. Use a lot of Jerusalem and of Zion, but it's not just, and this is the other thing I want you to get from this, it's not just a reference to God's people. This is used for Babylon, for Edom, for Egypt, for Nineveh, for Tyre, Sidon, and Tarshish. They would have been cities closely associated with the Phoenicians, a single nation essentially. So it's used, this is a general symbol that's used to refer to any nation or any city, not just God's people, not just Jerusalem or Zion. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. The daughter of Zion has an extra level of meaning. Again, think about not everybody of Israel is of Israel. There's a spiritual and there's a physical. That part of the symbol is unique to Jerusalem, to Zion. You're not going to say that. You're not going to have the inner-outer meaning as we're talking about Egypt or Nineveh or something. That doesn't make sense. But it does when we're talking about God's people. Malachi 3:16, it talks about the people using Malachi's message to speak to each other and encourage each other. You have that remnant in action. You see that at the end of Malachi. And they're encouraging each other to be faithful despite everybody else kind of falling away. And then as I mentioned, Luke 1 and 2, you see where that is successful, that there is a group of people who are still faithful even by the time you come to Jesus. So we have this core woman, if you will, the daughter of Zion, the faithful people of Israel who were responsible through whom Jesus came according to the flesh, as he says in Romans 9:5. So while we're kind of on this, I'm going to reach ahead a little bit into the chapter because it's kind of broken up and it's easier to explain now. So this same remnant, these people, this nation born in one day, what happened to all those faithful people who were faithful right up until the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus? What did they do in Acts 2? Well, if they were really the faithful, they would have responded on that day or shortly thereafter. And so what happens is this woman that represents the faithful people of God, Jerusalem, Judah, the Jews, once we get past Acts 2, it now becomes the church. So it changes its meaning. We're going to see in a little bit, we've already seen the devil is chasing after the woman, trying to persecute her, and he's going to eventually turn his focus on the children. All right, so keep in mind, what's the distinction between the women and their children? The women is the collective, the personification. It is the institution, if you will. The children are the individuals. So, with that in mind, what are we getting at? The church, God's people, as a collective institution, is going to be safe. It's going to be protected. It's going to be taken care of. It cannot be defeated. So, Matthew 16:18, right? I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. But her children, the individual saints, must be ready. They must be faithful unto death. The devil is going to come after the individuals, and he's going to have success on the individual level. So the individuals have to be prepared to stand and be ready to suffer and overcome even to death. So I think that's the meaning and the distinction between these two as we go through this. All right, this is a kind of technical and complicated part. Any questions about that? All right, keep chewing on that and think about it as we go through, because we're going to come back to this at the end of chapter 12. All right, so what happened in heaven? There's a war. Is it a literal war? No, because it's not any more literal than all the other things that we've seen. So a war breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail. Nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. So, what does this mean that he was cast down from heaven? Again, this is not literal any more than the other things. We're talking about a spiritual war. This is a figurative representation here. And I think the idea is like we saw the devil in Job 1 and 2, you also see this in Zechariah 3, where the devil is like playing the accuser. He is saying that God is not being fair and God's people are not who he thinks they are. And so he's accusing God and he's accusing his people. And it seems that at this point in time, he no longer has the right to make that accusation anymore. This is cast down. So, if he is accusing God's people of sin and God not being fair, not being just in dealing with it, at what point does he no longer have grounds to make that accusation? Once their sins are taken away by Jesus' sacrifice. Once the Son goes to heaven. So we have pretty close correlation that at this point, once Jesus is successful and victorious and goes, then the devil no longer has this right. He no longer has this place in heaven to make this accusation, so his focus shifts. So just quickly, Romans 3, this is something that God is very sensitive to, him being judged, and ultimately he will make sure that he is justified, that he wants to appear just. He wants to make sure that he demonstrates his righteousness and that we can see it. And so this is something that's very critical to God. And it's interesting in and of itself. Why does he care what we think and whether or not we understand that he's just? But he does. And so that's an amazing thought to think about. All right, this is probably, I think, one of the most critical passages in all of the book. How did they overcome?
By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death.
All right, very good. So I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength, the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. The accuser is cast down, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to death. Again, the first one, when did the devil lose his authority to accuse? When is it totally invalidated? Blood of the Lamb. All right, so those that relied on the blood of the Lamb took away that accusation. He can no longer make that accusation. But also the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life to death. So the forgiveness that came through Jesus' sacrifice, their willingness to not only testify themselves, but also to receive and accept the word of testimony. In other words, the apostles' witness, the gospel. But then the fact that they were willing to die for this. So this is the key thing that we have to take away. It's very easy to say. But this is where our thoughts need to dwell is, am I willing to do this? Am I ready to do this? If I'm not, what do I need to pluck out of my heart? Go back to the parable of the sower, right? Which of those thorns and thistles and do I need to dig up the ground and make sure that I am that heart, that good soil that's willing to go to death for this? So one of the things that I think is also helpful that I'll encourage you to spend some time thinking about that helps on this point, in Hebrews 2:14 through 15, it says, inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself, speaking of Jesus, likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So again, what was that last thing? They were willing to pay with their lives. And then set contrast to that, what is the thing that holds us in bondage? our sin, but why do we keep going back to sin? Why do we keep surrendering? It's because we're afraid to die. I believe you can trace every single temptation in every single failure on our part, if you work through it and think about it enough, because we are afraid to die. We're afraid we're going to miss out on something. We're afraid it's somehow connected to our fear of death. And by Jesus taking that away, he loses the power, the right to make the accusation, but we also have the strength to answer all of the temptations, all the challenges, and all the trials that cause us to give in to sin as well. I'll let you chew on that one and think about it. All right, thank you all for your time. We will pick up with question number 7 in the dragon's wrath. How does he respond to this defeat? What does he do next? See you all next time.